we'll just pick that very best embryo to
And
give
it's
them the
doing it on
best
time.
chance at success. Right.
You can pick a really good-looking embryo, can't you?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Welcome to the Dr. Gill Show. This is where we talk about medical matters that matter to you. My guest today is Melissa Fudge. Welcome to the show, Melissa. Good to see you. Melissa, you are an embryologist at Missouri Fertility, a fertility clinic here in Columbia, Missouri.
Yes, for about a year now.
About a year now. Wow. So an embryologist, for those that don't know, is a, kind of part scientist, part lab tech, part, oh my goodness, it's hard to pigeonhole it, but a medical professional, highly trained, who helps create and grow and care for human embryos in the lab.
Yep.
Is that a good description?
Yep. Pretty much covers it.
That covers it.
Yeah.
Embryology is a crucial part of advanced reproductive technology or assisted reproductive technology. And we use this ART, as it's called, for in vitro fertilization, to help people get pregnant who otherwise aren't making embryos or aren't getting them on target.
Right.
Yeah. So this isn't something that you just walk into, Melissa. Did you have any scientific training or schooling? Did you have to go to college?
Yeah, I went to the University of Missouri and got a degree in animal science.
In animal science?
Yeah, and then through that I found my interest in reproductive science and started out in cattle, actually.
Huh.
And bred dairy cows in Illinois for a couple of years.
Ah, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Cattle are pretty fertile, aren't they? If you inseminate a cow.
And
I have a lot of patients who are ranchers, they say fertility rates in cows are something like 70%. 70,
yeah, it's very high.
It's very high. So all you have to do is an insemination and a healthy, is it a heifer?
Yeah, or cows that have had calves before, because it's a year-round breeding for dairy cows since it's constant production. But yeah, they do programs to synchronize them and things like that. So I helped learn how to do those injections and set cows up for that.
So in some ways, it's similar to humans. They're mammals.
Yeah.
So some things are very similar.
For how the cycle works and what hormones do what. So Yeah, so I'm from the Columbia area, and we wanted to come back home. We were in Illinois when we did the dairy cows, and I got tired of chasing cows around and was more interested in the science. So I found a job at the university with Dr. Prather's lab.
Dr. Prather, he's rather famous in, and he works mainly with pigs, I think.
Yeah. So I was working on the scopes and helping do transfers in pigs and research and making clones and doing things like that.
That's some real advanced science going on in his lab. We don't clone humans, but no. I just heard something on the news just recently about them taking kidneys from pigs that have been genetically engineered to be received by a human, and actually potentially help with the kidney shortage.
Right, and then there was the patient that did the heart transplant as well a while back, and that's all related to the work that they're doing over there. It all starts.
It all starts there. So fascinating research, could help humanity tremendously. So that got you interested and trained in the work with embryos, eggs, sperm, embryos in pigs, which are a mammal about the size of humans as well. And what gave you the bug to come into the human world? Did you see an ad from Missouri Fertility, or were we so lucky to find you?
That's a lot tied into my personal experience with infertility. So when we moved back home,
Oh.
my husband and I had been trying for a while, and then we started to go through the process of figuring out what was going on since it hadn't happened. And I was over at the university's fertility clinic.
Okay.
And the embryologist there is Jamie Hogarty, and I got to know her well.
Our good friend. We love Jamie.
Yeah, and since I knew just enough to be dangerous, and the phone calls with her of the updates on my embryos, I had lots of questions. And she said, "What do you do?" And I told her what I did, and she was like, "Okay, that makes sense why you're asking the questions you're asking."
You know the words.
Yeah, so she made a joke of like, "Well, hey, if you ever need a job," and I kind of put that in my pocket because I was like, that would be a cool field to be in. And so then when I decided to move on to other things after MU, I just called or I emailed Jamie, and I thought she wouldn't remember me. She at least pretended to remember me. And she let me shadow her for an egg retrieval and gave me kind of the lowdown on what it is that an embryologist does every day. And then they weren't hiring at the time, and she connected me with David. And so then I came over here to shadow, and he said, "I'm going to treat this like a job interview," and just started telling me what you guys were looking for. So I was a little overwhelmed, but also the opportunity was just like laid out
There
in front
it
of me.
was.
So I took it because.
Oh, I call them angel moments. Sometimes
Yeah.
something just comes up, you don't expect it, and there
Right.
it is. There it is. So you were successful doing in vitro fertilization for your first child?
Yes.
You had your beautiful girl.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. So you have a personal connection to this as well.
Yes. I'm sure there are others, but I have the unique experience as an embryologist and as a patient.
Yeah. I share that with my patients too. My wife and I went through this too, and my second boy was from in vitro fertilization as well. So we've both benefited from it. Wow, that's so cool. So let's talk about embryology in general. I don't know, it was maybe 100 years ago or whatnot. I think they started experimenting with eggs and sperm, and I think one of the first IVF successes was with rabbits, I believe. Rabbits are fairly easy to work with. The eggs are fairly sturdy, or human eggs are very sensitive to light, changes in temperature, humidity, pH, very, very fickle and very sensitive. Where rabbit eggs and rabbit embryos are less so, and they were able to make IVF work, I think, in the early 1900s, 1930s or so with rabbits. There's a horse breeding farm just south of Columbia where they fly horses in from Saudi Arabia and South America, and they do IVF on these very expensive, fancy horses. And I went there. They had asked me to come down and see their operation and see if I could give them some advice on something. And I thought they were having me down there to look in their fancy lab and the clean air and could I give them any pointers on their lab? And one of the veterinarians there, he opens his cabinet and he takes out this dish in room temperature, room air, with horse embryos growing in it. And he showed them to me under the microscope, and they were black because they're so filled with lipids, these oils. They're tough as can be, easy to IVF work with, do IVF on horses. But we humans, very sensitive, very delicate, these eggs and sperm a little more robust, but human embryos very, very sensitive, hard to work with. So what type of environment is an embryology lab? What allows you to actually successfully make and work with human embryos?
Well, first, the air in the lab is very clean. There's not a lot of traffic in there. You try to minimize in and out. You're wearing a cap, scrubs, lab shoes or boot covers, just trying to minimize any kind of contamination from outside of the lab. And then
super clean air is really
as
important.
Clean as possible. And
don't they pump in the air and scrub it?
There's a few air purifiers running. pretty loud in there because
it's
of
loud
all
in
that.
there
Yeah.
because the air is getting filtered and pumped in under positive pressure.
Right.
Gets filtered and gets scrubbed. I think it's manganese perchlorate or whatever it is. It gets rid of these volatile things. So the air in there is very, very clean. It smells very clean. You do your best to minimize particulates and dust and all that stuff. So there's the air. What else do you have to do in there?
Most of the work is done underneath the hood. So that's also purifying the air and on a clean surface. And we don't reuse anything.
So everything's disposable, ultra clean, special plastic, special dishes and equipment. Wow. So let's talk about how do you create an embryo?
Well, first we need eggs.
We need eggs. So who feeds them to you?
Yes.
I do.
That would be your job.
I do. So
let's
explain this. There's the retrieval room right next to your lab.
Right next to you.
We got a little hatch door. So I'm retrieving the eggs out of the woman. They come in a special medium and a special fluid that's embryo friendly, right?
Right.
It's exactly body temperature. It's exactly blood pH. It's actually tube pH. It mimics all the proteins and the sugars and the salts and all that kind of stuff. So that fluid with the eggs comes into you. And what do you do with this? What's called aspirates. What do you do with that fluid?
We take those tubes and then dump them into big dishes and look under the microscope and what we call search for the oocytes. And we call out the number we're at per patient.
Yeah, so oocytes is fancy science for eggs.
Right.
And we've been doing this all morning. I'll just tell everybody we've been doing this all morning. We retrieve the eggs from the woman while she's asleep. It's a surgical procedure, as it were. And we send the aspirates to you, and then you search through this fluid in dishes and find the eggs.
Yeah, and they're ideally what we call pretty fluffy. It's a very small circle and surrounded by cumulus cells, which, like I said, appear to be fluffy. They're the cells that help the oocyte mature and grow while they're in the follicle in the ovary.
So these eggs in mammals don't grow just a naked egg somewhere.
Right.
They're in a growing cyst, and they're surrounded by these nurse cells or granulosa cells that feed this egg and are part of the process in maturing it. So you receive these eggs, and not all of them are mature.
Right.
Some of them are sometimes dead, aren't they? Or cracked.
Occasionally, yeah.
Brown, grainy, granular. So not every egg is healthy, is it?
No, it typically is the majority, but it's all dependent patient to patient and kind of what their scenario is and their age and all the things that play into egg quality.
So if a woman has medical issues or she's getting older, she's had failures in the past, she's more likely to have abnormal eggs.
Right.
And you can tell when you strip these cumulus cells off, you can tell if an egg looks healthy at least, right?
Yeah, taking all those cumulus cells off gives us a clean look at the egg itself, and we can tell if it's mature or slightly immature and maybe has potential in that waiting period between retrieval and when we would fertilize, if they are going to mature. And then there's ones that are very immature that
will not
be fertilized.
Yeah, I like this immature with potential. Sounds like me in high school.
Yeah. Right.
Right. So you get these eggs, and they're fresh, and they're kept, like you said, in a hood, and we watch them grow, or you watch them grow. And when they're mature and receptive, what do you then do with an egg?
Here, anyway, we do ICSI with all of our IVF patients, which is intracytoplasmic sperm injection.
So now you have to fertilize the eggs.
Yes, yeah.
And nowadays, because everything is so streamlined and efficient, you inject the eggs with a sperm, with the ICSI procedure.
Right. So that's after the sperm is prepared, we take those sperm and put it in a special media that kind of slows them down, makes them easier to catch. And then we'll take that and inject one sperm per oocyte into the cytoplasm of that oocyte. And that's using just a small needle-like tool to puncture through the zona, which is kind of the shell of the oocyte, and
There's
then
a shell.
yeah, put it directly into the center of that egg.
Now tell me about this table. Now it's a small needle on a big, heavy table.
Yeah.
Tell me about this 300-pound table.
Yeah, we call it a micro manipulator, and there's air helping stabilize the table so that it's not shaking when someone walks by, or keeping everything very still.
So the legs of this heavy table, so it's heavy, which gives it mass. I don't know if you're old enough. We used to have records.
Yeah.
And a turntable, the highest quality turntables were heavy. It was like you could have like a 40-pound platter. Man.
Yeah.
When that thing started spinning, it would keep its speed because it was so heavy.
Mm-hmm.
So you got this heavy table, and it's on air shocks, essentially.
Right.
And it was like you said, a truck goes by or a cow stomps its hooves somewhere, right? It doesn't transmit these vibrations. So you've got a vibration-free or a dampened surface to work on.
Right.
And go on, describe this micromanipulator for me.
So on one side, there's what we call holding, and it's a specialized pipette that does what it sounds like it does. It just has a bit of suction to hold the oocyte in place.
Okay, so there's a little tiny tube that we pull a little, and does that go in your mouth? Do you actually?
Nope.
We don't do that anymore. Because I remember in the old days,
No mouth
the
pipettes.
embryologists had these tubes in their mouth, and it was like they were playing a musical instrument.
Right.
So there's a mechanical suction, a tiny, tiny bit of suction that'll be used to hold the egg against it. So now it's stable.
Right.
Then what do you do?
And then the other side would be that ICSI pipette that has a tiny needle or barb on the end, and that is what we pick up the sperm, and then that's what we use to puncture the shell or the zona of the oocyte.
Okay.
And then into the cytoplasm, and then deposit the sperm.
And you can put in just one.
Yes. Yeah.
Now,
that's very important.
Well, what's just amazing though, to me, is that you'd think you'd have to put the sperm in a particular location. It would have to be just here, and once again, I'm showing my age. We used to think you maybe inject it under what's called in the perivitellin space, but it turns out you can inject it straight in,
Right.
and somewhat forgiving.
Yeah, they're sensitive, but they're at the same time they're tougher than you think. That they can withstand that, and they just kind of seal back up. Or I guess a complication that can occur is that the oocyte would lyse,
It can
so
break.
it wouldn't seal back up, and then that would be the end, or
The end of that one.
Yeah, so
End of that egg. So it has to be so you puncture it, inject a sperm, it seals over, and somehow that sperm wakes up or decondenses.
yeah. So then, once the sperm is introduced into the egg, then the DNA from the sperm and the other half of the DNA from the oocyte can then fuse and cause fertilization.
To make a whole. So the chromosomes in the mom have been pulled apart, and now you have half.
Right.
And in the guy, chromosomes are pulled apart. Now you have half in the sperm, and we can put the egg and the sperm together, and they reunite.
Right.
Just amazing. Just amazing that could happen. So you can then see the next day. Can you tell if they fertilize the next day?
Yeah, so the next day, first thing, we'll check for fertilization. And what we're looking for is the number of pronuclei. So 2 pronuclei would be an indication of successful fertilization. If there are none, then obviously there's not fertilization occur there. And then if there are 3, there's either something went wrong, or that happens if there's more than one sperm injected. But we take extreme care to make sure that that's not the case. But sometimes that just happens, and
from an egg reason or something,
Right.
and something with 3 pronuclei, that's not going to develop into a healthy embryo anyway, right?
Typically, no. That's a very first sign of an abnormality in an embryo.
It's abnormal pronuclei.
Yeah.
So you injected the eggs on, let's say, day 0.
Right.
On day 1, you're looking for these pronuclei, and there's inefficiency. It's rare that everyone will fertilize normally, but at each stage, there's generally some inefficiency. But where did you keep that embryo overnight between when it was injected via ICSI and you checked it the next day? What did you do with the embryo?
There's special incubators that we keep all the plates that we culture the embryos in.
All right, so you've got these plates.
Yeah.
So it's called test tube babies, but they're really dishes and plates, aren't they? Right?
Yeah.
So this is in a fluid called a media or medium, right? It has all these special chemicals in it. Now, is that dish just sitting there, or do you do things to protect it from the air? Or tell me about this actual dish that the embryos are growing in.
Depending on the dish, there's different volumes of media that fill those wells, what we call them, and then we cover it in oil.
You cover it in
So it
oil.
kind of seals.
Because the oil is lighter and it's on
Right.
the top. So these droplets with these precious embryos are under oil,
Right.
protected from the air. And then this whole dish is in an incubator.
Yeah.
Describe an incubator for me, because they used to be these big boxes and fans whirring. And tell me about a modern incubator.
We do have the big box incubators, but we don't culture the embryos in those. It's more for either media or just warming media. But the incubators that the actual embryos are in are what we have planar incubators. That's the brand. And as our andrologist likes to nickname them, they kind of look like a panini press.
A panini press, so they're about this big, right?
Yeah.
They're these little boxes about this big, and they've got their own fancy fans. And now, what is piping into those incubators?
There's CO2.
Medical grade carbon dioxide.
Right, and nitrogen.
And nitrogen.
And oxygen.
And some oxygen.
Yeah.
Now, the amount of oxygen in there, is that what we would experience here in room air, like 22% oxygen?
No, it's very highly controlled at, I believe, 5.5.
About 5% oxygen in there. It turns out in a woman's fallopian tubes, there's not the same amount of oxygen.
Right.
So these human embryos need the environment of a fallopian tube.
Right. Trying to mimic that environment as closely as possible.
So that's done in these now little incubators.
Right.
Just amazing. So I've seen them go from these big refrigerator boxes to these little tabletop incubators. So we got a bunch of these incubators. And don't you do your best to have, Mr. and Mrs. Smith in incubator A and Mr. and Mrs. Jones in incubator B, so that there's not even any mixing unless you're running out of space.
Everything is labeled over and over. Yeah.
All right, say that again. So people ask all the time, well, how do I know these are my embryos or my sperm or my products? What do you do to prevent a mix-up?
We make small sticker labels, and every plate is labeled. The top of the incubator is labeled. There's always a witness to everything we do.
Everything's witnessed as well.
Yeah.
And I know when we're passing the eggs from the patient, from the woman who's asleep into the lab, we say, hey, this is Mrs. Smith. This is Mrs. Mary Smith, date of birth, blah, blah, blah. So every step is witnessed and controlled and verified and double labeled and all this kind of stuff.
One patient at a time, always.
Always one patient at a time.
Right.
So this is a never event. You can really, if you're doing this right, you should never mix up
Absolutely.
Human tissue. So there's great care is taken to do that. So we've made the embryos, we've kept them overnight in an incubator, special gases, medical grade, super pure, temperature, pH, everything perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So the next day you can see how many fertilized by looking at the pronuclei. then typically what happens with these embryos that are being created for these relatively infertile couples?
So day 1 is when we check fertilization, and then day 2 we don't take the embryos out of the incubator.
You just let them grow, non-disturbed or undisturbed.
Right, and then day 3 is when we would take them back out and kind of see where they're at in their development. And ideally, there are about 8 cells, so they're starting to divide. And then we will kind of grade them on how uniform those cells are. You know, we'll count the cells. Sometimes it's 4, 6, 10, 12, but usually about 8.
So you can start to grade. So on day 3, it's a little clump of cells, about 8 cells, give or take.
Yeah.
And you can grade and evaluate them then. And some embryos can already be falling apart because they have abnormalities or of some sort. So we get some idea, once again, this going up this pyramid. So ideally on day 3, we've still got a good number of healthy appearing dividing embryos.
Right. And they're all kept in culture, whether they're looking not so great.
Give them every shot we can.
Yeah, we let them go through the whole process just to make sure nothing's thrown out.
Fantastic. That's also really good to know.
Yes. And then we do assisted hatching on day 3.
What is assisted hatching?
We use a special laser to make a tiny hole in the zona, or that shell.
In the shell.
Yeah.
Make a little hole on day 3. Why do you do that, Melissa?
It's assisted hatching. So we're trying to help the embryo as it develops and divides and the cells compact and it starts expanding, then it can hatch out of that cell, which happens naturally in the body, but we're just kind of helping things along.
Okay, so it gives a little start, a little hole through which to expand.
Right.
You know, I don't know if you have seen this, but if you take it's on YouTube, you'd see an octopus, right? It's in a box, and there's just a little hole, right?
Yeah.
It can slither its tentacle in there and squish its body through the hole, so this big octopus can escape through a little hole.
Same idea.
Same idea.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. The biggest part of it is its beak. It's got this hard beak, right? If the beak can fit through, the octopus can get out. So that helps the embryo get out. So, okay, so on day 3, you've graded it, drilled a small hole in the shell. Then what happens the next couple days?
So then that next day, we don't take the embryos out again.
Let
so
it
day
grow.
4.
Leave it alone.
Yep. And then day 5 is a big day. You're checking to see how that embryo looks. You're looking at the morphology of that embryo, of how the trophectoderm or the cells that will eventually form the placenta, how they look, how uniform they are, how many there are. And then you're looking at the ICM, or the inner cell mass, which eventually creates the fetus itself.
The fetus. So the embryo on day 5 has started to develop into a shell, a hollow ball.
Right.
And there's a clump of cells on the edge that will grow into the fetus, and the rest of the cells generally develop into placenta.
Right.
So you can grade that embryo on is it accomplishing these goals or these milestones?
Yes. It fills with fluid, so it gives a good view of the ideally tightly compacted ICM, that fetal cells.
And that's why it's called a blastocyst. A cyst
Right.
is a fluid-filled cavity, so it actually has that's why it's called a blastocyst. And then what is the embryo starting to do through that little laser hole?
Ideally, they're hatching out of that, so depending on what part of the embryo is coming out, usually it's the trophectoderm cells.
So it starts to bulge out the hole.
Yeah.
Starting to bulge out. And eventually it'll hatch all the way out until it's out of its shell, right?
Right.
Now, what is something we frequently do to the embryos on day 5?
Well, most patients, or a lot of patients, choose to do genetic testing.
Yes, and in our clinics, over 80% of our patients say, well, if we're going this far, let's go all the way.
Right.
There's an old British expression, if you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. Mm-hmm. You know, if you're going to do it, go all the way. So a lot of people And let's mention that a lot of people who are having infertility problems may be getting pregnant, but they're miscarrying and whatnot. There's abnormal eggs, there's abnormal genetics. So by biopsying the embryos at this point, we can find the embryos that are abnormal, that are destined to fail, can't we?
Right.
So how do you do this embryo biopsy, Melissa?
So ideally, there are some cells hatching out of the embryo because that makes biopsy a lot easier, a lot less
easier
invasive.
taking the cells from that bulge,
right,
rather than going in and trying.
And we want trophectoderm cells. We don't want to touch the ICM. We don't want to damage that.
That's a great point. So you can leave the inner cell mass alone,
right,
and biopsy just these cells on the outside that are going to make placenta,
right,
that are very resilient, and there's redundancy, there's extra cells there.
Right.
So you, with experience and training and the right equipment, can take some cells from the trophectoderm for genetic testing.
Right.
How do you do that? That sounds just frightfully difficult.
Yeah, so there's the holding, which we use.
So you're using the big table again,
anything,
the micromanipulator table.
Yes, and that same tool that's used to hold the embryo still. And then there's a biopsy pipette, which is just like a blunt. It doesn't have the barb that the ICSI pipette has.
So it's not as sharp.
Right, and it's kind of a dance between the two of trying to get about 5 to 10 cells of, you don't want to take too many because you don't want to take more than you need to from that embryo, but you also need to take enough that there's enough DNA there to amplify and see if the chromosomes are normal or abnormal for that embryo.
You need enough to test.
Right.
But you don't want, so it is a dance. You get just enough. It's like Goldilocks.
Yeah.
Just right.
And that same laser that we use to hatch the embryos on day 3, you can adjust the different things on that laser, but there's different settings then to use that to kind of start to tear away those few cells that you need. And those are put into tiny test tubes that are sent off. Yeah, very tiny.
So let's describe this a little more more granular detail here. So you've got this bulge of cells coming out. You can put this little suction pipette on there and sucks them in there, and then you can chop that little bulge off with a special laser.
Right.
And the embryo survives.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Another surprising thing that they can go through and be just fine.
They're just fine. They just kind of heal over and continue to hatch and continue to grow.
Right.
Yeah, I think this is a good time to emphasize that. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, I'm sure I'm off by a few years, we used to biopsy on day 3 when it was only 8 cells. Mm-hmm. And we'd remove 1 or 2 cells from the 8-cell embryo, and that was shown to hurt the embryos and decrease their ability to grow. But when they're day 5, and you're only taking 5 cells, and it's made of 200 or 300 cells.
Right.
You take trophectoderm, doesn't seem to hurt it at all.
Right.
When done by an expert embryologist.
Yes.
Like yourself.
Yeah, it takes a lot of practice. It's not something you just watch one time and then do. So
not an accident, is it?
Yeah, no.
It's the pinnacle of training and science here. So you can take a biopsy. So you take these cells. You said you put them in a tiny little tube?
Right.
And those are also labeled and separate, so you know that cells from embryo A are in tube A, and cells from embryo B are in little vial or sample B.
Yep.
So once again, there can be no errors there either.
Right.
And then what do you do with those little biopsy samples?
Those are sent off to another company that does the testing. And it's like 7 to 10 days or so to get those results back.
So it goes to a special lab with special equipment.
Right.
Where they can amplify the DNA and analyze the DNA through an incredibly complex. It's almost more than I can understand. This next generation sequencing and SNP arrays and exon. I could go on and on about it. And then the fancier the name, the less I know about it.
Yeah.
Because it's just a rapidly advancing field.
Oh,
Well, so it
yeah.
goes to an outside lab that's expert in doing just this PGT, pre-implantation genetic testing. And what do you do with the embryos that you've biopsied?
So right after we take those few cells to biopsy, the embryo is frozen.
You can do that.
Yes.
You can freeze an embryo.
Yeah.
Wow. Tell me, how do you freeze an embryo so that you can thaw it out again someday?
So through the biopsy process, it collapses the embryo. So the fluid that was in the embryo is now escaped. And then you put it in special vitrification media, freezing media.
Okay.
For different levels or different amounts of time. And then once it has gone through those steps, we load it onto a cryo device. We use a Vitrigard, and it's like a little straw. It sits on the very end of that with just a tiny bit of media, and then it's dunked directly into liquid nitrogen.
So you plunge it right into minus 196 or whatever it is, this incredibly cold nitrogen. So let's explain this part. You've taken the embryo and you've put it in essentially saltier and soupier and higher concentrated sugar, all those things. So it gets into thicker and thicker media, so it draws out the water, doesn't it?
Right, because we want to avoid the possibility of anything creating like an ice crystal.
So ice crystals are bad.
Right.
You make an ice crystal in an embryo in a cell, it can destroy the cell.
Right. So the better it goes through that process, the more likely it is to survive a thaw.
So you've kind of essentially pickled it a little bit.
Yeah.
Then do you put it in an antifreeze solution?
The media that's
very
used to freeze the embryo, it draws it out, and then it kind of fills back up with this cryoprotectant.
So this cryoprotectant seeps back into the cells.
Right.
So now they're drier and filled with antifreeze, and you can put them straight into liquid nitrogen.
Right.
Snap freezes them. I think it's 30,000 degrees per second.
That's very fast.
So in the matter of milliseconds, this embryo has gone from alive to frozen and suspended.
Right. Frozen in time.
Frozen in time. That's just amazing. How long are those embryos good for at that point?
I don't know the longest frozen embryo that has created a baby. Do you know how long?
The plain English, I tell our patients, it's a long time.
It's a really long time.
Longer than we've been doing it, right?
Yes.
So I think the record now is 20.
Years.
I think the record recently was 20, 25 years. I could be off. It's something in that ballpark. And I think they've used frozen sperm over 30 years, 40 years. Sperm freeze real easy.
Yeah.
Sperm are easy. They've been freezing sperm for guys for a long time. And in the animal world, they've been freezing sperm too a long time. So the answer, I believe, is we don't know how long.
Yeah, we'll find out.
We're going to find out.
Things keep changing and techniques keep getting better and better for the way that embryos are frozen. And so I feel like it just will improve.
Yeah, and my gut feeling is it's probably going to be centuries, maybe millennia, maybe thousands of years.
Yeah.
Because it's in the liquid nitrogen, super cold, and it's also in a metal tank, so it's somewhat protected from radiation. And,
right.
There's cosmic rays and all. There's radiation around us. In fact, people who live in brick houses have more radiation than people that live in wood houses. Why? Because there's even radiation that comes out of bricks from stones. There's inherent, radon and stuff that's in rocks. So they need to be protected from radiation. But anyway, so the embryos are good for a long time.
Right.
Certainly long enough for during our lifetimes to help start a family. Mm-hmm. So now you've frozen the embryo. The biopsy has been sent off if we choose to biopsy it. Right. Now let's say a couple is otherwise fertile. And I treated a couple recently. She had her tubes tied. She had a bunch of kids. She was a fertile myrtle. She met a new guy. Her tubes were not fixable. They wanted to do IVF. And we're going to treat them with just a fresh embryo transfer. So what happens on day 5, let's say they have some embryos, they've grown some embryos. How do you choose an embryo that we can put right back into her without even freezing it?
We're going to pick the best quality embryo. So the embryo that's giving us all the signs that it's got a great trifectoderm, nice and expanded, lots of cells, uniform cells, a tightly compacted ICM, and we'll just pick that very best embryo to give them the best chance at success. Right.
Right. So on day 5, if it looks good and it's maturing at the right speed, it's not lagging behind or blah, 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 you can pick a really good looking embryo, can't you?
Yes.
And we can still transfer that embryo fresh back into the woman if her uterus is receptive, if her hormones have been behaving, I like to say. Mm-hmm. So just by picking a good looking embryo, we can get really good success rates just from that.
Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. And if she has extra embryos, we can freeze the rest.
Right.
To use at a later time. So we don't have to do this genetic testing. But just by the looks and the growth patterns, we can pick best looking embryos. Now, do you know anything about these embryoscopes, these video systems that watch the embryos grow? Have you had any experience with that, or any thoughts on that evolving technology?
I've never gotten to see one, but I do know it constantly monitors the development of that embryo, and I know there's advantages to that because you don't have to take the embryo out of the incubator to check its development. Yeah. So it can stay in that environment as much as possible, which is only going to do good things, I would think.
You'd think. Now, so far, they haven't shown much of an advantage, but I envision, and I'm seeing data from artificial intelligence, the computers watching the embryos grow, or the software, or the whatever you want to call it, the AI, and they're claiming that they can that they're able to pick out the better embryos. I envision it's not quite ready for routine fertility clinics like ours, but I envision sometime that may become available. And you could always just pipe out the video data online to the cloud, and then the AI program can possibly help you pick out the better embryo. So that's coming probably. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people working on that right now.
Yeah.
Very exciting. So you've frozen the embryos for later. We've transferred an embryo. Now that's my world. I'm not going to talk about embryo transfers right now, but there's very special ways to do it. You have to be very delicate and do it just right. But if you pick us a good embryo, and if that embryo has normal chromosomes and is of high quality, we can get incredible pregnancy rates, can't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. They're running around in our hands around 80%, and some months even higher. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, there's going to be miscarriages, but with PGT and genetic testing, we have fewer miscarriages.
Right.
And increase the chance that lovely couples can have a lovely baby.
That's right. Just
amazing. So you've got these frozen embryos. What do you do with them?
Like I said, everything's labeled over and over. So that device that they're on is labeled with all the information pertaining to that patient, that cycle, the day it was frozen, everything. And then we have lots of paperwork as well matching with that embryo, and those are stored away.
So you've got the inventory paperwork or electronic records. Yeah. But what's the embryo? Where is the embryo actually existing?
Oh, in just a tank.
In a tank.
Special storage canisters and canes that the devices sit on. And
so the devices are in straws.
Right.
We used to call them candy canes. Do you still call them candy canes?
Yeah.
It's a little hook and it goes down into the nitrogen. So we've got these tanks. Tell me if I'm wrong. They're about this big.
Yeah.
They can look like R2-D2 units, from Star Wars.
Right.
So they're on wheels. They're about this big.
And filled with liquid nitrogen.
Liquid nitrogen.
Yeah, that we monitor daily to make sure that those levels
stay. So tell us about that, Melissa. A couple years ago, there was one or two famous cases where the nitrogen drained out and the embryos thawed and died.
Right.
So what do we do to prevent that from happening here?
First is the visual evaluation of the tank.
So every day you just check it out.
Yeah, there's signs that a tank would be failing if there's like condensation on the outside of the tank, or the lid of the tank is not holding that temperature, that liquid nitrogen. We're measuring the level of that nitrogen daily and
So there's
adding
sensors in the tank, aren't there?
for temperature, and then it would alert you if it was getting like dangerously low.
I think there's even an
Yeah.
alert that comes up. Nitrogen alert.
Right.
Alert. Nitrogen getting low. And what do you do if nitrogen is, because nitrogen's evaporating all the time.
Yes.
I mean, these flasks just slow it down. They're insulated, but it's not perfect. There's nitrogen always
Right.
turning to gas, warming up, leaving the big doer flask.
Yeah, we're measuring them every day, and then we're filling them to the appropriate level at least twice a week.
So you're topping off these tanks.
Right.
From a big tank downstairs that happens to be downstairs. So we've got a
Yes.
big tank of liquid nitrogen
Yeah.
that a company delivers to us. So we've got a reservoir of this liquid nitrogen.
Yeah.
And you're literally filling up little flasks to pour it in there to keep that nitrogen up to proper levels.
Right.
That's an ongoing thing.
Yep. Every day.
Every day. No Christmas, New Year's. You don't take New Year's off for that.
You're measuring them, and you know kind of the range where the tanks like to sit, and you know about how much evaporates each day. So maybe they do go a day or maybe 2 days without being measured, but you're making sure before that point that they are well full enough that they can handle a day or two without.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So you've got good equipment, close monitoring.
Right.
So those embryos should be very safe. Now, if somebody hasn't been around in a while, can you ship those embryos out?
Yes. So we can transfer those to a smaller tank with just the specimens that are being requested to be shipped wherever they're going.
So they can be shipped out
Yeah. Right.
to places. So they can be shipped to another clinic.
Right.
Now, are there some big commercial storage farms, storage areas where you can ship embryos?
Yes. There's, or at least we send like sperm samples or specimens that we're trying to store for a patient long term. We like to keep those at a facility like that so that we can free up space in our tanks for the IVF patients, for the IUI patients.
Yeah, so there are some long-term, I think
Yeah.
there's 4 big ones in the United States, I believe, where you can ship these materials, these frozen materials, and they're in a big-ass storage area
Right.
with all the nitrogen and all the monitoring, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it's super safe, super secure, probably a little cheaper to save it as well at one of these larger storage facilities. So these want people to know their embryos are safe. They can be shipped to somebody moves, they can go to another clinic. We can send their embryos on. Or if it's long-term storage, if someone's frozen their eggs, for example, we can send it to a long-term storage facility where they're safe and very well cared for.
Right.
Right. Well, this is just fascinating. Can you, do you have to have really stable hands to do this?
That's ideal. Yeah. Yeah, that's something I think comes with practice, and it becomes habit, and it just, you have to kind of work on that. And I think doing something for the first time, maybe you're a little nervous.
Oh, yeah.
And so, it's always best to practice those things before you're doing it on a real patient with, doing a retrieval or a transfer. It's something that comes with practice and confidence. And
that's for training and time and education, and working in a good team all work together to increase the competence to be able to do this very, very difficult work.
Yeah.
Wow. So a couple episodes ago, we spoke with Victoria Schulte. Look for that episode called The Sperm Whisperer.
Oh, yeah.
She told us how we collect sperm and freeze sperm, and she talked about how sperm can be frozen. Tell us, how do you freeze eggs? Because we don't have to make embryos, but they still need to be handled in the embryology lab. don't
Right.
they? Or the ART lab, I guess.
Yeah, eggs are even more sensitive, or they require a slightly different freezing process, but essentially it's very similar to what we do when we freeze an embryo, although we're not using a laser or anything like that on those.
So tell you what, let me set this up. Sometimes women will want to freeze their eggs and not freeze embryos. Might be a woman who's single, might be a woman who she's young and healthy and she has a career path. You know, she's joined a law firm or she's in the military. We see it in the military. So she wants to freeze her eggs when she's younger to be used later when she's maybe farther along in her career path.
Right.
Might be making a little more scratch, might be a little more financially stable. We also see young women who have cancer. Once or twice a month, my phone rings. It could be a young man too. A man or a woman has cancer diagnosis. They're going to need to be treated with chemotherapy, radiation, things that kill their eggs or their sperm.
Yeah.
And we get this call from this rather desperate person. Oh my God, I've got cancer. They're going to give me chemo. It's going to potentially kill my eggs. Can you freeze my eggs? So we can do that, can't we?
Yes.
All right. So tell me. So I'll just finish the thought here. So a woman comes in, we can very quickly start giving her medicines to make a lot of eggs, as many as possible, 1, 2, 3 dozen eggs. We retrieve them from her body. We hand them off to you in the lab. Then tell us, how do you freeze eggs? Now, please explain to us what you do.
So those eggs are treated the same way initially. We denude them or take off those cumulus cells. And we're looking at which ones are mature. And then after going through a bit of a waiting period, we're going to freeze those a little bit sooner in the timeline because of when they're thawed. I guess, well, no, I didn't.
In the future, when they're thawed.
Yeah.
So you're freezing them at a slightly different time.
Yeah, it's that same day. The same day that the eggs
are frozen pretty quickly.
Yes.
So you sort through the cumulus cells, get them off of there, look for the good eggs that are fully mature.
Right.
Then what do you do with these tiny, tiny little things?
They're frozen pretty quickly.
How do you do that?
The same way that we're freezing these embryos, where we're putting them in special media and putting them on a cryo device and submerging them in the liquid nitrogen.
So there's a preparation. So you go through this media. They're also dehydrated.
Right.
But it's a slightly different media than for the embryos?
No, it's the same vitrification media.
Same vitrification media. So it's the same idea.
Yeah.
So you kind of dry it out.
Act a little bit differently, but same idea.
Same idea. They're dehydrated. They look like little raisins. They get all shriveled up. Then there's antifreeze kind of permeates in. They get filled with antifreeze. And then you put them in a little device, and once again, just plunge them into the nitrogen.
Right.
Bam, snap frozen.
Right.
And that can work. That's amazing. Because eggs are very, very fragile. They're much more fragile than embryos, aren't they?
They are, yeah.
Yeah. In the old days, when we slow froze, the earlier technology, a number that was bantered about is if a woman wanted to do what's called elective egg freezing. All right.
Yeah.
She would have to, on average, freeze 80 eggs to expect them enough to thaw out properly and fertilize properly and make an embryo properly and to result in a pregnancy. And a successful pregnancy was about 80 eggs. Wow, that's how bad or how we were at it because it was so difficult freezing eggs. Nowadays, a young, healthy woman, I'll just throw this number out. On average, we would want to freeze about 10 eggs if she's healthy. If she's making healthy eggs, only have to freeze 10 eggs to confidently expect to have a live born. So it's vastly improved.
Yeah.
It's still not 100% and certainly not 1-to-1. It's certainly not going to freeze one egg and expect to have a child.
Right.
So you can do that dependably, reliably. And I know this isn't your part of it, but it's a lot cheaper than IVF.
Yeah.
We're not having to fertilize them. We're not having to culture them in the lab or whatnot. They're snap frozen. Boom, boom.
Mm-hmm.
It's done quicker, a lot cheaper. So this is something that more and more women are electing to do.
Right.
To have their eggs frozen. Wow. Now, is there anything else in the IVF lab that you find particularly fascinating, or something that you think our listeners would like to know about in the IVF lab? Did I stump the embryologist?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biopsy process is probably one of the most fascinating aspects that I've been able to see and learn how to. I've not been performing it myself quite yet, because like we said, it takes a lot of practice and you want to be very good at that before you're doing it on a patient. But
now, can you train on mouse embryos?
yes, or you train on embryos that have been donated to research.
Or embryos that have abnormal genetics, you can still thaw them out, even though they're not compatible with life. You can do these training runs and practice runs on these abnormal embryos to get you the training you need so you can help people in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've gotten to do that, the biopsy process, one time so far, but I've done lots of thawing and refreezing and things like that, just because there's a lot at stake, and you definitely don't want someone who's not ready to be doing that, handling patient embryos. So
so I'm going to call you the junior embryologist. You have a senior embryologist.
Right.
Happens to be named David Wax in our laboratory. Very, very experienced. Who, in fact, came through the same animal lab that you did at the university many years ago.
Yep.
So under his tutelage, you get trained up. And, we have the same issues with surgery. I'm an experienced surgeon. Where did I learn? Well, I had to learn somewhere, and you do it under the, under the teaching and the guidance and the tutelage of a senior surgeon, and they train you up like anything else in this world, right?
Yeah, and you take a little bit more responsibility here and there, and kind of get those small things under your belt and build that confidence, which is hugely important. So
yeah, these are well-established methods. Like I know when you're in a plane, there's the senior, the captain, there's the co-pilot.
Yeah.
Nowadays they look so young, look like they're in high school.
Yeah.
But they're getting trained up, and so just like everything else, there's ways to train up and measure competency and watch people grow and become skilled enough to do this amazing kind of work.
Yeah.
Well, Melissa, this is amazing work. You're an amazing person. Your skills are, I think you're being a little humble, but that's okay. You have tremendous skills. I foresee a tremendous career in embryology for you and with you. You're a great partner and team member here at Missouri Fertility. I'm very grateful that you're here, and look forward to many, many years of working with you. And I also look forward to the advancements that will happen. You can bet there's going to be tremendous scientific advancements. And the embryology you're going to be doing in 20, 30 years after I've retired is going to be truly, it's going to be just amazing to watch.
Always evolving. Yeah.
Always evolving.
That's the fun part of science.
It sure is.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for your time, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you.